Hello, hey, and welcome to my tent, a place to hear life experiences, different opinions, a range of journeys, and a viewpoint different than our own. A place to challenge our own thoughts, a space to learn a little bit, and I promise some fun along the way. I believe we're better when we let a range of people into our tents, so welcome to mine. Did you know that our health is encompassed by way more than just food and fitness? Did you know I'm a health coach? What is a health coach? I can tell you. I work with individuals and groups to look at all aspects of life that help make us truly well. I have structured programs to help you create realistic, challenging but achievable, and long-term transformations that span long past our time working together. I help you take a multifaceted approach to your health, ranging from food, fitness, relationships, work-life balance, financial health, gratitude and joy, creativity, career, and more. If you are looking to make a health transformation, visit my website in the show notes or email me, sarah@sarahjohnstonwellness.com. Cheers to good health. Hello. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. What about yourself?
I am doing well. Just getting through, I feel like, the week and doing the best that we can, you know?
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm super excited to chat with you. I'm a big fan of therapy, like for everyone. I wish more people went, but that's a different, I feel like, conversation. So I'm excited to have you here, everyone. We have Kayla Crane in the tent today, a licensed marriage and family therapist based out of South Denver.
Yep.
Amazing.
Denver, Castle Rock, which is in South Denver.
South Denver. We have lost so many friends to Denver. Everyone keeps going there. It's incredible.
The hot spot.
It is. I know. We have a couple friends that are there. We're trying to get out there maybe at like the end of the summer to see some people, but we love Denver and that is amazing. So thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to dive in, but if you just want to start off and just give a quick hello and maybe a very brief introduction of yourself, then I can kind of dive into some of the questions I have for you about all things marriage and family therapy.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I am, like you said, a licensed marriage and family therapist. I specialize in couples therapy as well as trauma. I am trained in a specific type of trauma modality called EMDR. Some people might be familiar with it, some might not be, and it's pretty cool. We use eye movements to process trauma.
Yeah, isn't it well, correct me if I'm wrong, a newer form of implementing therapy? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say maybe over the past 20-ish years.
Okay. Yeah.
So, yeah,
I've heard about it. I've heard about it in like podcasts and whatnot, but from what I hear, it's an extremely effective modality of therapy.
Yeah, it's highly preferred as far as processing trauma. You don't have to talk much about the trauma, which is a, definitely a bonus, right? Because a lot of the traditional talk therapy, it's kind of painful to talk through it again.
Yeah. So my first question for you is what was your background and interest in wanting to go down this specific route of therapy? Because I think it is a specialty within the therapy world and also so highly needed. So what was the motivating factor behind wanting to become a couples and family therapist?
Yeah, so I was originally going to school to become a special ed teacher. And in the midst of that, I was kind of dealing with like a 14-ish year eating disorder. And so while I was in school, I decided it was kind of time. It was recommended I go to residential treatment. And in there, you do a lot of therapy. All day. And it was, I had some like incredible experiences that truly changed my life, maybe saved my life, and some not so great. And so I was really motivated. I was like, I feel like I can kind of pick up on what works and what doesn't. And so I went into therapy, never expecting to work with couples. That I was so intimidated with couples. And then at one practice, they gave me a couple to work with, and I just immediately loved it. And then I went and I just went and got trained in a really great couples modality, and it's just kind of I just love to do it. I like to incorporate the trauma work into my couples because everyone has trauma
Yeah.
from outside of their relationship. There's a lot of trauma inside a lot of relationships. So kind of works nicely together.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting too is probably not all in terms of gender stereotypes, but and if it's a heteronormative couple, like men and women can tend to process emotions really, really differently, which is where I think a lot of conflict and hesitancy around conflict resolution potentially comes up. I mean, I know my husband and I process and discuss, we have very different kind of modalities of that. So what is that experience of having at the same time is it almost like you're addressing or thinking of it as like two people separately and together? Like, how do you sort of navigate? There's two people sitting in front of you. Something may work for this person and not for this person. What does that look like? And how does that show up in your practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes and no, right? We do, or not a no, but yes and yes, right? I do work with them in the kind of helping them kind of hone their own communication skills and tools. And then, of course, how they can work together with that. I tell people a lot, even if they're a great communicator, it still needs, you need to be able to communicate with that specific person.
Hmm.
Um, an example I give is oftentimes, a lot of people, if you're texting different people, you text differently. Or if you're speaking on the phone, you speak a little differently depending on who you're speaking with. And that's because you kind of have to shift your communication to complement whoever you're communicating with. And
Yeah.
it's not different in a relationship. So, yeah, I teach them kind of the basic skills that everyone needs, how to communicate vulnerably and all that kind of stuff. But then also, how does it work together? Because even if like I said, if you think you're the best communicator in the world, you still need to be able to do it with your partner and it's still a learning process.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that analogy because it is true. Now I'm thinking of like all my friends and how I text them and like my mom and versus, whatever. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle because the way that I also think of it and try to approach things too is like for a lot of your life, you're responsible for you. You're a independent person. And then you bring someone into your life that you do need to consider the majority of your decisions and your actions and how you're working with each other in the same home. And that to me actually was kind of a challenge to be like, oh, I actually have to consider you like all the time. Like I can't just do things that I want. Like you have to consider this other person. And then, we brought a child into the mix 2 years ago, and then you're kind of having to incorporate all these things. And so for me personally, I sort of felt like when we started living together, we did live together before we got married. I'm like, oh, I kind of have to be like a different person and not in a bad way, but it's a very jarring like juxtaposition of like, oh, I lived for myself for 30 years. And now I have to like live with this other person. So, what are some of the common things that you see a lot of people struggle with in relationships, and what are some of like the biggies that people are typically coming to you with, and some of the resolutions or tips that anyone listening can maybe also start to implement in their own relationships?
Yeah, very often, like one of the most common dynamics that we'll see is what we call like the pursuer distancer or pursuer withdrawer. And so what that looks like is so my relationship, I'm the pursuer, my husband's the distancer. And so when there's conflict, I want to talk about it. Let's take care of this right away. And he needs some space. So he needs time, but that makes me feel uncomfortable and anxious. So I want to push more. Right. And that makes him distance more. And so it's like
Yep.
this endless cycle. So just, and being able to identify what your cycle is like the number one thing, right? So because once you have that information, you can interrupt that cycle. I tell people, I think the most important like rule, or not rule, but tool in couples therapy is what like a timeout. And so and a timeout is it's got to be a little structured than just walking away, because then the pursuer feels, kind of abandoned or left, and that just like cranks up the anxiety. So when somebody needs space, or even if you don't need space, if you're seeing your partner needs space, right? If you're just seeing this is not productive, call a timeout, but you set a timer, and whatever you both agree will come back in 2 hours or 3 hours or however long you agree to. Um, and then you always have to come back at that time. So even if you feel like, okay, it's been 2 hours and I'm not feeling ready yet, you still have to come back and say, hey, I need another hour or
Mm,
whatever it is. And that gives both partners what they need. It gives that pursuer, it gives them that confidence that, okay, I'm okay. I can kind of tolerate this. I can wait because I know that they're coming back. And it gives the distancer some space and time. And when you're in that cycle, likely you're dysregulated. So both people need a timeout, even if the pursuer doesn't want it, they probably need it. It's probably not going to be productive. And so the reason I say that's so important is because it you can't use any of the tools when you're dysregulated. It's
mhm.
just not going to happen, right? So you need to be able to take the break and compose yourself, figure things out, and then you can come back and use the tools, what you've learned. And what we call it when you kind of get triggered or you're in conflict is like your adaptive child. So that's your inner child that's kind of running the show, and that's not who you want in the conflict. And so when you can take the break, ideally you can go to what we call your functional adult, and then come back and have a mature, hopefully productive conversation. It could still be a disagreement, but it doesn't have to be to escalate and kind of, go nowhere.
Yeah, be as explosive, I feel like, because you're pushing, and the other person's resisting. And I feel like I'm the exact same way. I'm like, we're discussing this immediately right now. And my husband's like, give me a moment, because
Yeah.
we're also very different. Where like he internalizes a lot more. And I am like hard on my sleeve. I'm going to tell you what I think and I'm going to do it right now. And I've actually really had to work on that over the years too, because sometimes those things that come out of my mouth are not always what I want. It's, the nasty things that you can sometimes say to the people that you love the most. And I've had to almost implement those pauses to be like, reword what you're trying to say. When I want to say something like, you never do the, you never take out the trash. And then I want to be like, okay, Sarah, take a beat, but let's reword that because it can be a little bit kinder. But what you were saying about like the inner child state, does some of that also relate back to the trauma? And so are you sort of digging into like that piece of it because that's how it might present on both parties when the conflict initially arises? Is that sort of where that layers in?
Yeah, the type of therapy that I do, it's called relational life therapy. And a big piece of that is exploring, because everything goes back to childhood. It really does. And every single child, everyone has childhood trauma, which is scary to hear as a
I
parent.
know. I'm like, oh,
Yeah, it's true, and so we just need to, so we do that. We do like inner child work. And if somebody's getting if- I was working with somebody recently who every time they felt like they were getting criticized, it would just like, and even if it was just kind of feedback or anything, it was very triggering. And so we kind of went through, and it turns out that there was a history of that. And when they were a child, felt like they weren't ever doing anything right. And just that's an example of when you get triggered, and it doesn't that's why I love this type of therapy, because on the surface it doesn't really make sense, and
yeah.
you're kind of people go, why is this such a big deal? Why is it important that I, text you during the day? Well, maybe that person has struggled with abandonment as a child and that feels comfortable to them, or, whatever it is, but it does always go back to childhood. And so just doing that work is helpful for the client who's doing the work to kind of have some insight. And then they can ideally, maybe during a timeout kind of say, okay, maybe this is a trigger. And what we say when that happens is you're responding to a situation that's not currently in front of you.
Mm,
Right. So it's not overreacting, what people, usually refer to it as. You're reacting to something from your childhood. And then it's valuable for their partner to watch that work because that will really evoke some empathy. And now I see how meaningful this is to you, why it's important. So they'll be more inclined to do what the other partner wants.
yeah. Or at least find some understanding. I mean, it's interesting. And my question is like, do some people sometimes come to you and have like no idea what their inner child even struggles with? Is that a common thing?
Most of the time.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless it's someone that's been in therapy probably
Mhm.
before and done this type of work. So do you watch this fascinating process unfold where they have these light bulb moments and are like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. Like, I get
Yeah.
it. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like it's like a mystery that we're putting together and like we're putting all the pieces together because my job is to kind of sit back and notice like okay that was a big reaction to what happened. And so like that's somewhere where we need to explore a little bit more. And that's usually you, people will say, I had no idea that that contributed to that. So it's really like I said, everything, so many of our maladaptive behaviors are, and that's why we call it the adaptive child, because as children, we have to adapt to our surroundings.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, we need to, maybe somebody had a scary or angry parent, they're likely to withdraw, want to take space or be alone because that's what they had to do as a child, maybe. And that might look like those repeated behaviors in adulthood. It might look like substance use. That's another form of escaping. Um, so it's just these, how we adapted as children when we get triggered, that's what we go to. Um, and so being able to recognize that it's, oh, now I see I am again responding to a situation that's not in front of me. And I can realize that my partner is a safe person and I don't need to escape from them. And it's a process, right? It's
Yeah.
a whole new behavior that you have to establish. So sometimes when we do it, they'll come back and say, oh, I didn't do it every time, or you're learning something after 35 years of behaving this way or however long. Like you gotta, give yourself some grace. It's gonna take a while.
Yeah. The behavior change process is lengthy for anything, even like a simple, I want to wake up 10 minutes early. It is a very difficult process. So in health coaching and in fitness, like I see this a lot with
Yeah.
people being frustrated that it's not taking as quick as they would like. They want these things to kind of happen at a quicker turn and a quicker pace. And even when we get to a point where the behavior changes much more of the everyday life and is easier, there's going to be times that we get it wrong. And we're having a day and we're tired. So we do say that thing that's nasty, that even if we've worked so hard on it. So, how do you work potentially with clients on that? And in those moments where there's like then maybe that disappointment of like, oh, I'm kind of disappointed in myself for reacting to that. I've been working really hard on it. And then is that a little bit of a broken trust? And like, how are you sort of working to repair when two people have been working extremely hard on something to make, each one feel seen and heard, and then something goes awry because we're human beings and we're not perfect people. How does that either shift? And then how do you have to kind of remeld uh, like a conversation or relationship after those moments?
So yeah, we the first thing is to just totally normalize it. Like this is going to happen, this is my career and it happens to me,
Yeah.
so it, you can have all the practice in the world and still, everyone's going to slip up a little bit. And when we try to repair, or what I teach them to do after they're done working with me is to just try to kind of get to the vulnerable feeling because I would say like 99% of the time, anger is really masking a more vulnerable emotion.
Yeah.
Usually some form of pain or fear, something like that. But when somebody's just hurt us, we don't want to be vulnerable with them, right? And so we just kind of mask it with anger. So I try to teach them to let's, really look into this anger. What else could it be? Could it be, feeling insecure or feeling lonely, something like that. And then you can work from there. I see I've hurt you, and then repair. First, you validate what your partner is feeling, right? I imagine that you must have felt really hurt when I said those things, or you try to really put yourself in those shoes, and then you have to be vulnerable with what you're really trying to, I guess, demonstrate,
Yeah.
or the emotion that was the underlying emotion, um, and kind of push through that anger.
Yeah. And that's an incredible point. I've talked about this, outwardly too. I talk about my experience with grief when my dad died. I wasn't sad. I was pissed. I was pissed off for a long time. And anger was the thing that just exuded from me for a long time. And I had to work through that before I could actually be sad. And it confused people that had maybe never experienced it. But a lot of people were like, wait, yeah, I kind of get that. And it was masking the underlying stuff that was going on. But an interesting thing that happened, and maybe this happens in the couples that you work with as well, is sometimes when we're so close to someone or living with someone, like they can get the ricochet from a scenario that they did not do. So my anger around my dad dying would sometimes ricochet. Like things would ricochet onto my husband, and he'd be like, "I didn't do anything. Like I didn't say anything, and I just walked in the door, and you're just not mean to me. Like what is happening?" So does that happen in couples that you work with as well? And how do you also say like, okay, there's obviously the things that you're going to do to each other that are going to affect and either hurt or whatever. But then there's things that other people or other things are going to do to you that have nothing to do with the other person, but may like leach in. Does that play into this whole dynamic too?
I mean, absolutely, right? Your partner's you come home from a stressful, hard day at work, who's there, right? A lot of times you can't, get so angry with your boss or your client or whatever you're working with, right? And so the only person left is your partner. And so they get it. Well, they get that kind of what you said, like that spillover, residual anger, frustration, and those kinds of things. So yeah, it's very, very common. And it's that's it where it's important for, both people to be able to, uh, or at least one, if we
Yeah.
can at least get one person, try to help them explore what was going on and have that patience. Try not to take it personally. I tell a lot of people, like, especially if they're in my office, you guys are working towards the same thing. They're not intentionally trying to hurt you. Maybe it feels that way,
Yeah.
and that's not and that's valid, right? But try to keep in mind that they're they're triggered, they're upset for something, and you kind of what I was just saying, you are the closest person, and help them get to what's going on. What is this anger? Maybe if you were expecting an email from a boss or a client and you don't get it, maybe you're angry, but perhaps it's really rejection,
Mm.
right? And if your partner can help you get to that, or if somehow you can get to that, then you really got something to work with, right? Now we see you're feeling rejected. Let's talk about that, because anger, there's not a lot to work with there,
It's
so
a tough one because I don't find it to be a useless emotion because I think it helps me typically like explore what is happening. But then I'm like angry about being angry. That's my fun thing. I'm like, I'm mad that I'm mad. And then
yeah.
it's a whole thing. But what's really interesting too is it can feel maybe potentially confusing sometimes. And this is like, again, what I draw a lot from my own relationship because my husband, it very rarely is angry, like,
Mhm.
or at least like in the way that I exhibit it. So sometimes it's hard to like read those signals because I am very outwardly like red in the face, like sometimes physical symptoms of my anger kind of like exudes in that sense. And his anger can be quiet. And is that something that confuses couples or is a challenge sometimes of like, how do I read something that I don't know the language in? Like, where we're feeling similar things, but there's this like decoding that sometimes I feel like has to go on. Like when he does certain things, I'm like, ooh, you're angry. And I know that from being with him for 10 years, but it's sometimes it's like we're not speaking the same language, but we're feeling the same things.
Mhm.
And it's tough.
Yeah, it is. And, the first thought there is that can be really challenging too, because a lot of people grew up like in angry households, and maybe it wasn't even, violent or anything, but maybe their parent yelled a lot or screamed a lot, and that was scary. And so it can be really uncomfortable if you notice, like, you start making up that, oh, I think they're angry, and if you grew up in a very scary household or angry household, likely you're going to be kind of hyper aware to a lot of nuances in their behavior. Like a slight shift in their body language, you might pick up on and get really anxious. And that's because, again, as a child, that's how you adapted, right? Like I had to be able to recognize if my parent was going to be angry, and then I could leave the room or go in my own room, or just a slight shift in tone or anything like that. So that can be one challenge to kind of pick up on. This is not your scary parent, right?
Yeah.
And then conversely, it can also be scary if that outward anger, it can kind of do the same thing. So being able to recognize that, and sometimes I'll teach people to just remind their partner, I'm not your parent.
Mm,
I love you. I'm your partner. I'm on your team. Um, so that is the first step, being able to do that. And then a really good tool is using the phrase something like what I'm making up right now, or
mm,
the meaning I'm making, because a lot of times if you feel anxious about it and you're picking up on these cues from your partner, sometimes people say, you're mad at me. You're mad at me. I see that you're mad at me. And people don't like to be told how they're feeling.
right.
Right. And especially if it's something like a tiny shift in their body language, because you could have read that completely wrong. So if it comes off much better if you say, I'm making up that you're angry right now, then it kind of can open up a conversation, and your partner can say either, yeah, I'm mad at you, or I'm mad at
Yeah.
something else. I am angry, or no, I was just, I was just shifting in some way, or
Yeah. I grunted because like I sat on something on I
right.
sat on the remote or
Yeah.
yeah, that's I think a lot of us can and this is where I think the value of like clear communication and finding out ways to say what you're feeling with like more clarity. I think, that could that's a big thing is like and now I'm like really wanting to go all back into my inner child. Because I have those like people pleasing perfectionism tendencies, I am sure came
Yeah.
from something way back then. But
Yes.
what's interesting is my brother has like none of those. And
Mhm.
we grew up in which is always like, how? And like my dad's a twin and they're like wildly different, which is also interesting. So there's something there. But I think being able to effectively communicate that. I do have a question in terms of like vulnerability, because I do feel like this is takes participation from both sides. What is the scenario, or like what does one do if one party is much more open to be vulnerable than the other? Because then is that like, okay, I feel like I'm pulling teeth with this person. Like I am trying my best to level set, explain, do all of these things, and there's kind of a wall up. Because I talk to plenty of people and my friends who are like, it's really tough to get my partner to be vulnerable. And I am doing my best. So, what does that look like in terms of dynamics and partnership?
Yeah, I see that very often, and first we'll explore like what what stops you from being vulnerable. Maybe it's your partner gets defensive every time you say something, so you don't want to communicate that. Um, but also helping teach them this is what you're going to get out of it, right? You're going to get what you want, which is maybe peace or, whatever it is, connection with your partner. That's really the key, being able to communicate vulnerably. Also, when usually, again, anger is masking vulnerability. And so I try to teach people anger really pushes people away. And so you're not going to be able to communicate anything that ideally we want in a healthy relationship when you're just demonstrating the anger. So if you can be vulnerable, likely your partner is going to, you guys will, that'll pull somebody in closer, because we don't really care if our partner is angry typically, but if they're feeling scared or if they're feeling hurt, usually we don't want that, and so we'll say,
Yeah.
okay, let's work as a team and let's get you not feeling that way. Also asking them, like, how can I respond in a way that feels okay and feels safe to you? And again, it's not going to be perfect. However, if you can just ask them, and sometimes they won't know, but we can kind of try to work through it and practice. I'll have people practice like a designated time, and the instructions are to just share a feeling that you've experienced that day. And not having their partner at all respond that's like step one. Partner doesn't respond, they just listen. Because so many times we listen to respond rather than listen to understand. And so if you can just practice one, just talking about your feeling and then you're done, it feels a lot safer because then you have control over how much you share, what you share, and your partner is not going to get defensive. They're not going to kind of ask for more, try and get more out than you're comfortable sharing. And when you continue to practice that, you eventually it becomes a little bit more normal.
Yeah, especially if someone maybe isn't historically used to, I will say how I feel all day long. It comes naturally to me. But I feel like in terms of like a family dynamic and with your children, like this comes heavily into family as well, of how we're operating and interacting with people that we're very close with, our own children, our family members. I think it's an interesting thing to think about as well. And I think a lot of what you're probably teaching your couples helps them interact with the world and the people that they're interacting with and close with on a daily basis.
Yeah, definitely. And the best thing we can do for our children is just model how to communicate most effectively and vulnerably and not go straight to that anger. So that's how kids learn what's
Yeah.
modeled to them. They'll pick up on a lot more on what's modeled than what's just told to them.
Yeah. Yes. And they will repeat everything.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
My son has already dropped a few swear words. He is too. So
Yeah.
like, oh, great. Uh Whoopsies, sorry about that. But it's yeah, I think it's a really important tool to be able to effectively communicate to the people that we let into our circles and have those be maintained in terms of partnership in specific. The natural progression of things, as well as some of these things that maybe are not worked on as much as they should be. Sometimes in partnership, you end up, moving outwardly instead of either in a line or even closer together. And that can be in the form of communication, is that you sort of become ships in the night, could be intimacy. As relationships progress and people are coming into being together for however many years they're together, what does that start to look like? I wonder some of the themes that you start to see people have been together for 10, 20, 30 years. Um, and you operate in a certain way and you maybe start drifting. Like, what are some of the ways to get back at least towards center to being on the same path rather than maybe a more distant?
Usually when that happens, I feel like I tell people this all the time and it's so therapist-ish. And it's what I've been saying the whole time. It's vulnerability, right? Usually when that happens, you're not being vulnerable. And so that's the key really, is being able to be vulnerable and share what you're feeling and what your needs are, and being open and receptive to what your partner is feeling and what their needs are. And after people have been in a relationship so long, it sometimes does just become normal. It just develops like habits. I was working with a couple the other day, and right as they were leaving, one partner mistook how the other partner comment they made just kind of as they were walking out. And then the dynamic was they kind of got angry and defensive. And then their partner I looked at them and they were just like, forget it. And then I was like, is that usually what you do? And they're like, yeah, there's no point. And, they're not going to hear me. And so like, that was a really good, like real life example of how that kind of comes into play. And so in that kind of moment, you teach both partners, like, what was it that made you shut down and hopeless and not even want to try to correct them or, explain what you meant. And maybe they're getting defensive or they get angry or whatever it is. And so then you go to that partner. How can you be more open to, again, recognizing that they're your partner, they're on your team, they're not just saying things, usually, hopefully their intention isn't just to hurt you on a regular basis, right?
Yeah.
Maybe on the occasion when they're really angry, they might say something hurtful, but by and large, they're not just trying to say things just to make you mad. You both want a happy, peaceful relationship. So trying to keep that in mind and asking for more clarification when you kind of jump to those conclusions, that's important.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause I hear this, you get to the roommate stage sometimes. And I think what we experience, and I think naturally, I talk to a lot of my friends, when you first have a baby, that's always a big thing because there's this like small human being you have to keep alive. So obviously your time has shifted drastically. But from what I hear from a lot of my friends who all have kids that are now coming at least a little bit more into independence and routine, sometimes it's harder to come back. We're like, ooh, okay, we kind of got into this comfy zone of I basically am treating you like my roommate, where I'm keeping the peace and like, we keep the common space tidy and we kind of don't really share and or hear. And it's kind of a struggle to be like, how do we find marriage again versus like two people, sleep deprived people that are simply just surviving? It's like you stay in that survival mode. And I think that's a common thing too, is like, how do we even get back? And like, no one's necessarily done anything hurtful or at least outwardly. And there's no real like trigger of like this person keeps doing X, Y, and Z. It's more so just like, okay, this big shift happened. This person came into our lives. And then we, for about a year, survived. And now we can't really figure out a way to be married again.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? It's the biggest probably change that most people ever experience in their life is bringing a child in. And no matter how many classes, books, whatever, no one can truly prepare you for what it's going to be like. And I think, I mean, it's very cliche, but it's so important to prioritize each other. Um, Setting some time aside, however often, even if it's, once a week or something, and doesn't have to be a formal date night, because that's another challenge, finding a
Yeah.
babysitter and all that stuff. But maybe you really are intentional about setting some time aside, uh, after the baby goes to bed and whatever it is, you can even connect over watching a show together or watching a movie. It doesn't have to be this huge elaborate thing. A key is not having your phone on when you're or not playing with your phone while you're watching the show or movie. But also just having your favorite or having a dinner together after the baby goes to bed, and just being intentional about those things that you're going to probably be doing anyway, but including your partner in it. That is so it's really valuable because I think a lot of us take it for granted, that, oh, this is just, I'm just watching a movie. That's not a big deal. But you can really have your partner in, and then you guys can have a talk about it, or, think about it the next day. Also, what your ask your partner what makes them feel connected to you, and
Yeah.
maybe it is you texting them throughout the day, or once a day, or maybe it's them bringing you a cup of coffee, whatever it is that feels loving to them. You can do that, right? So there are ways to connect even when things are different and things are really hard. And also, no one else in the world knows what it's like to be a parent of that child
Yeah.
than your partner. And so, like, lean on that, right? You can really connect over, maybe it was a really hard day, maybe your baby has colic, and, whatever it is, you guys can lean on each other with that, because no one else has that experience except your partner.
Yeah. I always laugh. I don't think it's a bad thing because I know some people are like, we're going to go out on a date night and we're not allowed to talk about the kids. I'm like, that's all I feel like we should talk.
Yeah.
It's so fun to talk about like the weird
Yeah.
thing that he said the other day, or that like, his quirks, and like, obviously we can talk about other stuff too, but I'm like, I think it's fun to talk about our kid when we're out on a date night. But I liked what you said about like exhibiting behaviors. So is that like a loose love language kind of type situation? Yeah. And that's been interesting too. And I encourage a lot of people, I mean, I'm fascinated by it, to know their partners, because like my husband, his top is physical touch. That's my last.
Mhm.
But like a hug is very important and valuable to my husband. And I know that. And so he also knows that like I don't love 1,000 hugs a day. And so when I do make an effort to do that, it's nice. And I'm like, if you unload that dishwasher, oh, I love you. I know that I feel so seen. It has taken something off my plate.
Mhm.
But I think pairing a lot of these things together, things that trigger you from your inner child, and like how that person receives love is really important. Because it is true, like we don't have a lot of time anymore. Like we have very limited time. But when I get home and that dishwasher's unloaded, I am like, wow, yes, you do love me. I feel so loved. And I do. I really do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of times when people, they hear, whatever it is, they kind of assume um that that's what will get that need met, that they know what will get the need met. And e- that's a big category, right? Acts of service or physical touch doesn't have to just be sex.
Right.
No. And sometimes people, I hear that a lot, actually. They'll say, my partner's love language is physical touch, and I just don't want to have sex all the time, or whatever. And it's like, well, you can still, sometimes that just means like you said, a hug, or
Holding hands. Yeah.
something like that. And I was recently working with someone, and they were saying, I'm doing all of these acts of service, and they're saying that's not it. And we'll ask them what they do want, and ask them what would feel good, and right then the partners, cleaning my car, bringing me coffee, like, they were able to list it. But it's just that direct communication that I think so many of us like take for granted, that
Hmm.
we could just ask them.
Yeah. I sometimes the simplest thing is to just ask the direct question
Yeah.
instead of making all the assumptions.
Mhm.
Because yeah, I feel like it could be easily misconstrued of like this person feels like they're doing 75 things a day to help that person, and they actually don't really care about that. They're like,
Yeah.
they want, words of affirmation. They want them to say, "I'm proud of you." That to someone is like more impactful.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, my husband and I both did our love languages, and we're direct opposites in like so many ways. But uh, he's like, "Really? You just want me to like vacuum the carpet?" I'm like, "Yes,"
Yeah.
because I don't have to then do it, and like it frees up space and time for me. But yeah, the direct question. But I think some people are probably sometimes scared to ask it because don't know what the answer is going to be. That like uncertainty of like, I don't know what their response is going to be. Like, are you mad at me is probably a scary question to ask.
Yeah, and I think we also assume we know. Like
Mm,
I know my partner better than anyone, and that's not always the case, you know. And I tell people when they sometimes think kind of what you're saying, those two complete opposite love languages, some people get a little discouraged. When in any case they feel like that their partner and them are just like so different. I try to reframe that and say you're actually complementary,
mm,
right? Because if both of you only wanted acts of service, then there might not be any physical touch in your relationship,
yeah.
right? Or if only both of you wanted physical touch, then maybe there wouldn't be that communication of the words of affirmation or anything like that. So it's not a bad thing when you and your partner are different if you can again reframe it, look at it from that perspective. Oh, we can complement each other nicely. Again, with like the pursuer distancer, if you can work with it,
Yeah.
it can be complementary rather than a disadvantage.
Right. Oh, I love that. Like a reframe of like, we can't do it because we're too different rather than being like, well, that's maybe just like a little puzzle piece.
Yeah,
It fits together. We just have to find the right ways to do it again, which is why I'm like, I wish everyone in the world had a therapist. I think the world would be a much calmer,
I agree.
more
Yeah.
amicable place. So I love the work that you're doing. What is on a docket for you now? Like what's coming up in your world? What are the fun things that are coming out both in your business and all of that jazz?
Yeah, I love to offer couples coaching intensives. And I in the state of Colorado, I can see clients and do couples therapy intensives. So the difference is that therapy we can do like the trauma work and stuff like that. Coaching is more providing skills and tools and kind of helping facilitate that healthy communication stuff. And I can do that with everyone. And then, yeah, like I said, I love utilizing the trauma work inside couples therapy. That's not super common. That's why I like the modality that I use.
Yeah.
It's encouraged to actually do the trauma work in the presence of your partner, with which it's traditionally not done in that way, but it can really be valuable for the relationship for both partners to see that. So I really love incorporating that.
Phenomenal. I will also be linking all of the things, your bios, your pages, where people can find you. But this was so much fun. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule, your busy day to talk to us. I feel like there's been a lot of good tips, things that I want to start to implement. I need the pause. That's because I'm the
Yeah,
pursuer. So I need to start implementing the pause. That's going to be my thing. But I feel like there's a lot of really good tips here that people can use to implement, and y'all can check out all of your links and all of your social and all of your site and everything. But really, I really appreciate you coming into the tent. So welcome in. You're here for life. That's what I say. So thank you so much.
I loved it. It's great.
I appreciate you. All right. Thank you again. And we'll chat soon.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in to the Welcome to My 10 podcast. I hope you had as much fun listening as I do recording. I am so happy to have you here, and see you next episode.